Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to take a look at working with sound in MoGraph, which means we're going to be taking a look at the sound field, which is also very similar to the sound effector. Let's go ahead and get started. So here we are in Cinema 4D. I have a basic setup here with a simple cloner where it's just a cube that has a little bit of a fillet applied. And I've just adjusted the spacing on the x-axis and set the count to 6. Okay, now, as I mentioned, we have a couple different ways of working with sound. We have the sound effector itself, or we have the sound field, which we can apply and work with in just about any of these other effectors. And the sound field is generally the way I prefer to go. Okay, but they are very similar. So I'm going to start by creating a plane effector. And because I had the cloner selected, it's going to automatically get applied. And at the moment, this plane effector is moving these clones up 100 centimeters on the Y axis. So from here, I'm going to go to the fall off tab and I'm going to create a sound field. Now, this sound field, this section here is going to be identical to what we would see if we actually worked with the sound effector. Okay, so they are the exact same. But the advantage of the sound field is that it works on just about any effector. So let's go ahead and start by loading in a sound. All right. And right away, if I hit play now, what we'll see is my cloner and these clones are moving based on whatever's happening in my sound file. Now, we have this frequency graph down here, which is going to represent the amplitude as well as all the different frequencies in this sound file. And then we have a probe, which is going to allow us to specify and work with just a section of this graph. Okay, so we can work with the probe's size here, its width, as well as its height. All right, and all of those can be found down here in the probe properties if you want even more precise control. But we'll come back to this section in a little bit. Okay, so I can click add probe here, and that's going to give me a second probe. Now if I hit play, we can see that the clones are doing something very similar. Okay, because I have two probes, the first probe gets applied to the first clone, second probe to the second, and then it repeats itself, or it iterates based on whatever I have this distribution set to. Okay, so I could also do distribute, which is going to try and split up the clones and apply them equally. So give 3 clones to the first probe, 3 clones to the second probe. I also have blend, which is going to try and smooth everything out between these. Okay, generally speaking though, I recommend having 1 probe per clone if you're working with a cloner. Okay, so I need a total of 6. And this guy, I'm going to want right around here for later. 4 right now, so I need 2 more. Those ones don't matter too much. So I can go ahead and set my distribution mode back to iterate. And so now each clone is going to have its own probe to work with. Now when it comes to these probes, generally what you want to do is try and size it so that the graph here stays inside of the probe and generally has some good range of motion from the top to the bottom. Because the more movement we have inside of that, the more movement we're going to get from our plane effector, because the strength of the plane effector is controlled by how filled this probe gets. So right now, this probe is, has a value of 0.758, which means it's going to have 75% of the plane effector applied to it. So it's going to be moving up roughly 75 centimeters. Okay, so the more we get this graph, this frequency moving up and down inside this probe, the more variation we're going to get in that movement. Okay, so Can definitely resize some of these a bit, try and get some more movement. If I'm still not getting as much movement as I want, the easy way to fix that is to come into the plane effector and increase the value on the y-axis. Now I am currently just using position, but I could do scale as well. Okay, in fact it actually looks pretty neat. You could also do rotation if you really wanted to get crazy. So it just depends what you want your clones to do, how you want them to move, scale, or rotate. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. Now we already talked about the main probe properties here, adjusting the low frequency, high frequency, low loudness, high loudness. Okay, but we also have some other properties down here. How this probe is going to be sampled as well as decay. So for sampling, right now it's set to peak, which means it's going to use the highest value inside this probe as the percent it should apply the effector. Okay, now we can switch that to say average, which is going to average it all out for us. Notice how we no longer have the value when we switch this to average. And keep in mind the sampling type, as well as decay and all these other probe properties, are per probe, right? So I could have, this probe set to average. This one could be set to peak. Our other mode is step. Okay, and you can see it's trying to figure out what's happening there. Okay, so we definitely have a lot of control with that. I personally prefer average, as it does tend to give us just a little bit calmer motion than what we get with peak. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. And then we also have decay. And decay is really nice because it's going to slow down the movement. So I added just 1% of decay. And so what that means is this clone is going to take a little bit longer to come back down after it shot up based on what's happening in my frequency graph here. So that can be another way of calming this down. And you'll notice now that I've really kind of fine-tuned this first clone to kind of work with the bass drum here. Okay, so once again, I can do this to all of them or adjust these values individually depending on whatever it is I'm trying to do. And really, that's about it, okay? There is one last thing I want to talk about with the sound effector, and that is utilizing color. As you may have noticed, we do have a gradient down here, and we can also see that gradient in our probes. Now, to get this color to show up is a little bit of a weird thing. You almost have to trick Cinema 4D into showing it for us. So I need to come into the color remap section of my sound field and switch it from no remap to color. Okay, now I do want to point out here that if we do this, the color we're going to get is also going to change based on the strength. So that can be an interesting look. But if I just want my gradient, all I have to do is go back to no remap. So no idea why that ends up being the case, but now we have our gradient, and I can go back in my sound field into the sound tab and work with this gradient any way I see fit. Okay, you can add more colors in here, whatever you want. All right, you can see depending on the placement, does kind of change how these colors are distributed with our probes. Okay, now even though we have this color here, if we were to apply a material to this cloner, and I'm going to use an Uber material because that's my favorite standard or physical renderer material. If I apply this material, I'm going to lose my color. And that's because it's really just the field color, and so that's not going to work in our material. Okay, the way to fix that is to go to our node editor, and in our assets option, we want to search for MoGraph. So all we have to do is drag this node out, connect the color port from our MoGraph node to wherever we want to pipe this color into, whether that's diffuse, could also be emission. We'll just leave it with diffuse for right now. And it doesn't look like anything's happening here. But if I go and render this, There we go. Okay, so that is the sound field and essentially the sound effector as well. Okay, hope you guys enjoyed this video and you found it informative and useful. Take care.